The flu hit me like a sledgehammer at 2 in the afternoon, turning the world into a blurred mess of sweat and shivering. I left the job site early, leaving the framing unfinished, and drove home with my teeth chattering. I didn't call Lydia. I just wanted to crawl into the darkness of our bedroom and disappear. When I pulled into the driveway of our split level, the house looked perfectly still, a silent monument of beige siding and manicured lawn. I used my key, the heavy oak door swinging open on hinges I'd personally greased last month. I expected the quiet hum of the air conditioner and the smell of Lydia's vanilla candles. Instead, the air felt thick, vibrating with a frequency I didn't recognize. I kicked off my work boots and stood in the foyer, my head spinning. I heard a sound. It wasn't a loud noise, just a rhythmic, frantic scraping, like something small and desperate trying to find a way out of a box. It was coming from the center of the house where the main hallway meets the stairs. I stayed still, leaning against the doorframe for support. The scraping stopped instantly. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was a held breath. "Lydia?" I called out. My voice sounded thin, raspy from the fever. No answer. I walked toward the kitchen, my socks silent on the hardwood. On the counter sat a glass of water, still sweating, and a plate with a half-eaten crust of bread. Someone had been here seconds ago. The scraping started again, louder now, coming from inside the wall that separates the pantry from the downstairs den. It was a hollow, frantic thumping. "Cyrus! What are you doing home?" I jumped, my heart hammering against my ribs. Miriam was standing at the end of the hallway, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She wore a crisp linen blouse, her silver hair pulled back into a knot so tight it seemed to pull the skin of her forehead upward. She looked entirely too composed for a Tuesday afternoon in my house. "I'm sick, Miriam," I said, wiping sweat from my eyes. "Where's Lydia? And what is that noise?" Miriam didn't move. She didn't offer a glass of water or a chair. She just watched me with those pale, analytical eyes. "Lydia is at a showing. As for the noise, the house is old, Cyrus. Rats in the wall, most likely. I've told you for weeks that this place is falling apart beneath your feet." "I built half this interior myself," I muttered, moving toward the sound. "It's not rats." The noise intensified. It wasn't the skittering of a rodent. It was the heavy, deliberate impact of something larger. It was a frantic, muffled drumming. I reached the section of the wall near the pantry. This was an unused space I'd framed in years ago to hide the HVAC ducting, a small maintenance cavity that shouldn't have been accessible to anything bigger than a mouse. "Cyrus, leave it alone," Miriam said, her voice dropping into that school administrator register she used when she wanted to end a conversation. "You're delirious. Go lie down. I'll call a professional in the morning." "I am a professional," I said. I leaned my ear against the drywall. I could hear breathing, heavy, terrified hitches of air. My fever spiked, a wave of heat washing over me that had nothing to do with the flu. I looked at the baseboard. The trim was slightly askew, a hairline fracture in the caulk that hadn't been there this morning. I didn't think. I didn't argue. I went to the garage and grabbed my framing hammer and a pry bar. When I came back, Miriam was standing right in front of the wall. She didn't look scared. She looked annoyed, like a teacher watching a student fail a simple math problem. "Move, Miriam. You're going to regret making a mess of your own home," she said. She stepped aside, crossing her arms. I drove the claw of the hammer into the drywall. The sound of the gypsum shattering was deafening in the quiet house. I ripped away a jagged chunk of the wallboard, then another. Behind the insulation, in the cramped dark gap between the studs, I saw a flash of blue fabric. I tore the rest of the sheetrock away with my bare hands, ignoring the dust coating my lungs. There, curled into a ball in the cramped dark cavity, was Gage. My 7-year-old son was tucked into a space no larger than a suitcase, his knees pulled to his chest. He looked at me, his eyes wide and vacant. his face streaked with dust. "Gage? Buddy, what are you doing in there?" I reached in, my hands shaking, and lifted him out. He was light, far too light, and he didn't cling to me. He just sat on the floor where I placed him, staring at the hole in the wall. "He was playing a game," Miriam said smoothly. "Children have such strange imaginations." Gage didn't look at her. He leaned toward me, his voice a dry whisper that barely carried. "Daddy, look down." I looked at him, then back at the hole. In the darkness of the crawl space, beneath the bottom plate of the wall, there was a loose section of the subfloor. I reached in, my fingers catching on a piece of nylon webbing. I pulled. A heavy black duffel bag slid out of the wall. Then another. I dragged them into the light of the hallway. I unzipped the first one. It wasn't filled with clothes or toys. It was packed with folders, bank statements, and 3 thick envelopes stuffed with cash. I opened one of the folders. It contained a set of new passports, Lydia's, Gage's, and Miriam's. Underneath the passports were printed emails, hundreds of them. I recognized the names, the dates, the cold, transactional language of a relocation specialist. There were maps of a town 3 states away and a lease agreement for a house I'd never seen, signed by Lydia 2 months ago. I looked at the second bag. It held Gage's favorite books, his handheld game console, and several sets of his clothes. This wasn't a hidden stash of valuables. This was a staging area. They were practicing. They were teaching my son how to disappear into the architecture of his own home so they could move things past me without being noticed. I looked up at Miriam. She hadn't moved an inch. She was looking at the bags with a sense of mild disappointment, as if I'd simply spoiled a surprise party. "He's not very good at being quiet yet," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "But he'll learn. Accuracy takes time, Cyrus. You of all people should know that." My head was spinning, the fever and the realization warring for control of my senses. I looked at the documents again. I saw a printout of my own medical records, highlighting my recent bouts of exhaustion and disorientation. I saw notes in Lydia's handwriting about my unpredictable behavior. They weren't just leaving, they were building a case. They were framing the narrative of a man losing his grip on reality, while they literally hollowed out the world around him. Gage reached out and touched my hand. His fingers were cold. "They said if I stayed in the wall, we could go to the new house sooner," he whispered. I felt a coldness settle in my chest that had nothing to do with my illness. It was a sharp, crystalline clarity. I looked at the hole in the wall, the raw wood of the studs, the dust of the shattered drywall on the floor. I had spent years building this house, perfecting the joints, ensuring the foundation was solid. I had treated every beam and board as a promise of safety. Lydia's car pulled into the driveway. I heard the engine cut out, the familiar chirp of the car alarm. I didn't move. I stayed on the floor, with the evidence of my erasure spread out around me. Miriam straightened her blouse and walked toward the front door to greet her daughter. She didn't look back at me. She didn't need to. In her mind, I was already a ghost, haunting a house that no longer belonged to me. I looked at my son, then at the bags. I thought about the way I'd been gaslit for months, the misplaced keys, the forgotten conversations, the subtle hints that my memory was failing. It hadn't been stress. It hadn't been the job. It had been a calculated, slow-motion demolition of my identity. The front door opened. I heard Lydia's voice, bright and professional, talking about a closing she'd just handled. I heard Miriam whisper something to her, the tone urgent but controlled. I looked down at the floorboards, the ones I'd installed with such care. I knew exactly where every nail was. I knew which boards squeaked and which ones were silent. I knew the secrets of this structure better than anyone. They thought they were using my house to hide from me. They thought they could use the spaces I created to trap me in a life that was being dismantled behind my back. I stood up, my legs heavy but stable. The fever was still there, but the haze had evaporated. I looked at Gage and put a finger to my lips. He nodded, a small, somber movement. This wasn't an impulsive exit. This wasn't a crime of passion or a sudden panic. This was a project, and if there was one thing I understood, it was how to manage a project from the ground up. I reached out and took the black duffel bag, sliding it back into the hole in the wall. I picked up the jagged pieces of drywall and leaned them against the opening, masking the damage as best I could in the dim light of the hallway. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to pack my own bag and run. I was a carpenter. I knew that you don't fix a rotten foundation by putting up wallpaper. You have to strip it down to the studs. You have to remove the rot, piece by piece, until there's nothing left to support the weight of the lie. Lydia walked around the corner, her smile faltering only for a fraction of a second when she saw me standing there in my sweat-soaked shirt. "Cyrus? Honey, you look terrible," she said, her voice dripping with a practiced, hollow concern. "Mom said you were acting confused." I looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the woman who had signed a lease in another state while sleeping in my bed. I felt a strange sense of peace. The house was quiet again, the scraping had stopped, but the air was still vibrating. "I'm fine, Lydia," I said, my voice steady. "I just realized there's some work that needs to be done. A lot of work." I walked past her, my shoulder brushing hers. I didn't look at Miriam. I went to the kitchen, took a long drink of water, and began to think about the measurements. I began to think about the pressure points. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the first day on the job. The fever broke in the middle of the night, leaving me drenched in a cold sweat that smelled like copper and wood dust. I lay perfectly still in the dark, listening to Lydia's rhythmic, shallow breathing beside me. For years, that sound had been my anchor, the metronome of my domestic life. Now, it sounded like the ticking of a countdown. I didn't move my head, but my eyes scanned the room, noting the shadows of the dresser and the closet door. I wondered how many of my things had already been quietly moved to those black bags downstairs. I wondered if the very bed I was lying on had already been marked for sale or abandonment in a ledger I wasn't allowed to see. I got out of bed at 4 a.m. My joints ached, but the mental fog was gone, replaced by a cold, structural clarity. I walked through the house in my bare feet, feeling the grain of the floorboards. A house speaks to you if you know how to listen. It tells you where the weight is shifting, where the moisture is seeped in, and where the termites are hollowizing the beams. My house was screaming. Every quiet corner felt like a pocket of air trapped in a sinking ship. I went to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee, the sound of the water bubbling the only noise in the pre-dawn gloom. I sat at the island and pulled out my phone. I didn't look for messages from friends or news updates. I opened our shared cloud account. I'd always been the one who handled the hardware and the heavy lifting, while Lydia handled the digital paperwork. She thought I was tech illiterate because I preferred a tape measure to an app, but carpentry is about geometry and logic. Logic travels across platforms. I found the folders hidden 3 layers deep in a directory labeled Historical Tax Backups. It was a masterpiece of administrative deception. There were spreadsheets detailing every asset we owned, but the valuations were skewed. She'd been slowly depreciating the house's worth in her notes, documenting structural issues and unresolved mold that didn't exist. She was preparing to buy me out for pennies or justify a lopsided split. Then I saw the name, Evan Cross. He wasn't a realtor. A quick search revealed he was a consultant specializing in high-asset relocations and discrete transitions. He was a professional ghost maker. I leaned back, the steam from the coffee hitting my face. This wasn't just a wife leaving a husband. This was an extraction. Miriam's influence was all over the phrasing in the emails, the cold, clinical focus on the child's optimal environment and minimizing the father's disruption. They talked about me like I was a faulty water heater that needed to be replaced before it leaked and ruined the flooring. "You're up early." I didn't flinch. Miriam was standing in the doorway, wrapped in a heavy gray robe. She didn't look like a woman who had just woken up. She looked like a sentry who had never gone to sleep. She walked to the counter and poured herself a cup of coffee, her movements precise and elegant. "Couldn't sleep," I said, my voice low and steady. "The fever's gone. I have a lot of work to catch up on." "I imagine you do," she said, taking a sip. She didn't look at the wall I'd smashed yesterday. I'd patched it with a temporary scrap of plywood and a single screw before I went to bed, a bandage on a gunshot wound. "Lydia was very concerned about your outburst yesterday, Cyrus. She thinks the stress of the new contracts is affecting your stability." "Stability is my job, Miriam. I know exactly where the load-bearing walls are." "Do you?" She smiled, a thin paper cut of a gesture. "Sometimes the ground shifts beneath the foundation. No amount of bracing can stop a house from sliding if the hill decides to go." "I'll keep that in mind," I said. I spent the next 3 hours in my workshop in the garage. It was my sanctuary, a place where the laws of physics were the only ones that mattered. I began to pack a small, ruggedized case with tools I rarely used for residential work. A high-gain acoustic microphone used for detecting leaks inside walls, a digital borescope, and a series of small wireless sensors. I wasn't going to play spy with hidden cameras. I was going to monitor the house like a living organism. When Lydia came down at 7, she was already dressed in a sharp power suit, her hair perfectly coiffed. She acted as if the previous day's discovery hadn't happened. She kissed my cheek, her skin smelling of expensive perfume and calculated indifference. "I have a long day, honey," she said, checking her watch. 3 showings and a lunch meeting with the city planners. "Will you be okay with Gage today? Miriam can take him if you're still feeling under the weather." "I'm fine," I said. "Gage and I are going to do some chores. I want to teach him about maintenance. He seems interested in how things are put together." I saw a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, a brief ripple in the polished surface of her persona. "That's great. Just don't overdo it. You looked so pale yesterday. We were really worried you were losing your touch." "I've never been sharper," I replied. After she left, I took Gage out to the garage. He was quiet, watching me with that same intense, observational stare he'd had in the wall. I didn't ask him about the bags. I didn't ask him what Miriam had told him. Instead, I handed him a small digital level. "Gage, I need you to help me check the house," I said. "We're going to see if anything is out of alignment. If the screen says 0, it's level. If it doesn't, we make a note. Can you do that?" He nodded, his small hand gripping the tool. We spent the morning moving through the rooms. While he checked the door frames and the windowsills, I was doing something else. I was recording. I placed small, vibration-sensitive triggers in the floor joists beneath the master bedroom and the kitchen. I swapped out the screws in the door hinges for ones that would emit a specific, high-pitched creak if opened at a certain angle. I wasn't just observing them. I was turning the house into an extension of my own nervous system. Around noon, I took Gage to a park, but my mind was back at the house. I had reached out to Nolan Price, an old friend who ran a small contracting firm. We'd worked together for a decade before Lydia convinced me to go solo so she could manage the brand. I met Nolan at a quiet diner on the edge of town. Nolan looked at me over a plate of greasy fries, his eyes sympathetic. "I heard you were having a rough patch, Cy. People are talking." "What people, Nolan?" "The local board. Some of the architects. Word is you've been missing timelines, showing up disoriented, losing your temper. Lydia's been, she's been reaching out for advice on how to handle your burnout without hurting the business. She's protecting you, or so it looks." The precision of it was breathtaking. She hadn't just been preparing to leave, she had been poisoning the well of my professional reputation so that if I tried to fight her, I'd be seen as an unstable, failing man. She was making me a liability in the eyes of the community I'd built. "Is that what you think?" I asked. Nolan shook his head. "I know you. You're the most meticulous guy in the county. But Cy, when the realtor who represents half the high-end builds in the valley starts crying in an architect's office about her husband's decline, people listen. I need a favor, Nolan. I need you to pull the permits for a project on Oak Street. A house Evan Cross is involved with. Nolan's expression shifted. Cross? He's a shark. He doesn't do renovations. He does liquidations and clean breaks. Why are you looking at him? Because he's the one trying to move my furniture when I'm still in the room, I said. I went back to the house and found Miriam in the garden, meticulously pruning the rose bushes. She snipped at the stems with a pair of sharp silver shears, her movements rhythmic and merciless. She didn't look up when I approached. I checked the crawl space again, Miriam, I said, leaning against the porch railing. The rats seemed to have moved on, but I found something interesting. The plumbing in the guest wing is backing up. It's a mess. I'm going to have to shut off the water to that side of the house for a few days to fix the main line. Miriam stopped pruning. The guest wing was where she slept. It was her private fortress within my home. That's highly inconvenient, Cyrus. I have guests coming for tea on Thursday. Can't be helped, I said, my voice airy and casual. Unless you want the floors to warp. You know how much you hate it when things fall apart beneath your feet. She looked at me then, her eyes narrowing. For the first time, I saw a spark of genuine calculation, a recognition that the underestimated husband was no longer following the script. She didn't argue. She just went back to her roses, the snip, snip, snip of the shears the only answer. That evening, when Lydia returned, I was sitting in the living room with the lights off. I wasn't hiding, I was just listening. I could hear the house settling. I could hear the faint electronic hum of the sensors I'd installed. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a notification. The sensor on the basement door had been triggered. I didn't go down there. I waited. 10 minutes later, I heard the sound of a car pulling away from the curb down the street, a car that hadn't been idling there before. I checked my cloud account again. A new file had been uploaded to the historical folder. It was a digital copy of our homeowner's insurance policy, but the beneficiary information had been altered. It was a draft, not yet submitted, but the intent was clear. They weren't just taking the son and the money. They were making sure that when they left, there would be nothing left for me to stand on. They were planning to burn the bridge while I was still halfway across it. I stood up and went to the basement. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked straight to the corner where the main electrical panel was housed. I looked at the wiring, the neat, orderly rows I'd installed myself. I knew how to make a circuit look overloaded without it actually being a hazard. I knew how to make a house feel haunted by its own mechanics. I reached out and flipped a single breaker. The lights in the guest wing went dark. A moment later, I heard Miriam's muffled exclamation of annoyance from upstairs. I smiled in the darkness. They thought they were the architects of this transition. They thought they were the ones who decided when the story moved to the next chapter. But a house is only as strong as the person who knows its secrets. I wasn't the rat in the wall anymore. I was the one who built the wall, and I was about to show them exactly how much pressure a structure can take before it finally, irrevocably snaps. The following morning, the air in the house was as thin and brittle as old glass. I woke up before the sun, my mind already calibrated to the day's requirements. In my line of work, you learn that the most important part of a renovation isn't the demolition, it's the containment. You have to seal off the areas you're working on, so the dust doesn't ruin the rest of the structure. I was currently in the process of sealing off my life, and Lydia and Miriam were the contaminants. I spent the early hours in the guest wing's crawl space. It was tight, smelling of damp earth and fiberglass insulation, but it was familiar territory. I wasn't there to break anything. I was there to adjust the tolerances. With a precision wrench, I made a series of minute adjustments to the plumbing valves and the HVAC dampeners. By the time I climbed out, the guest wing, Miriam's sanctuary, was effectively decoupled from the house's comfort systems. The air would stay stagnant, and the water pressure would be a frustrating, inconsistent trickle. It was a minor inconvenience that would grow into a psychological sandpaper, wearing down her sense of control over her environment. "Cyrus? Is that you in the hall?" Lydia's voice drifted from the kitchen. It was her concerned wife voice, the one she used when she knew she was being observed by the neighbors. I walked into the kitchen, wiping grease from my knuckles with a shop rag. "Just checking the pipes, Lydia. I told Miriam the plumbing was acting up. It's an old house. These things happen when you stop paying attention to the details." Lydia was hovering over her laptop, a tight expression on her face. "Well, pay attention quickly. I have the Henderson walkthrough today. It's the biggest listing I've had in 6 months, and I need the house to be perfect. I'm bringing them by here afterward for the contract signing. Miriam said she'd prepare tea." I poured a cup of coffee, watching the steam rise. The Henderson listing was a sprawling mid-century modern on the ridge, a property Lydia had been courting for a year. It was her ticket into the upper echelon of the regional market, the kind of win that would provide the liquid capital she needed for her discreet transition. "The Henderson place," I mused. "That's the one with the cantilevered deck and the custom walnut cabinetry, right?" "Yes," she said, not looking up. "It's a masterpiece. I can't afford any distractions. I'll make sure everything here is memorable," I said. As soon as she left, I headed to the ridge. I didn't go to the front door. I went to the site as a contractor. I knew the crew working on the Henderson landscaping. I'd thrown them subcontracting work for years. A few casual questions about the drainage and a mention of concerns regarding the foundation settling were all it took. In the world of high-end real estate, a whisper of structural instability is more damaging than a fire. It's a scent that lingers in the rafters. I didn't lie. I simply pointed out the natural erosion patterns on the hillside, patterns that any carpenter worth his salt would notice, but a realtor would overlook in favor of a view. By the time I left, the lead landscaper was already calling the architect to re-verify the load-bearing specs. The seeds were planted. I spent the afternoon with Nolan Price at his warehouse. We sat among stacks of lumber and the scent of sawdust, an environment that felt more honest than my own living room. "I pulled those records you wanted, Si," Nolan said, tossing a folder onto a workbench. "You were right about the Oak Street property. Evan Cross isn't just a consultant. He's the primary lien holder on a shell company that's been buying up distressed assets. And guess who's been the listing agent on every single one of those distress sales?" I opened the folder. Lydia. She'd been feeding Cross inside information on homeowners in financial trouble, helping him scoop up properties at a fraction of their value and taking a secondary commission under the table. It was a neat, circular system of exploitation. And now, I was the next distressed asset on their list. "They've been framing me as the weak link," I said, my voice flat. "Lydia tells the town I'm losing it, and Cross moves in to help her manage the fallout. They get the house, the business, and the kid, and I get a one-way ticket to a state-funded facility because I'm unstable." Nolan looked at the floor. "It's a cold way to build a life, Si." "They aren't building," I said. "They're scavenging. There's a difference." I headed back to the house before the Hendersons were scheduled to arrive. Miriam was in the kitchen, her face a mask of cold fury as she tried to coax a steady stream of water from the faucet to fill the kettle. The guest wing was stiflingly hot, the HVAC having failed an hour ago. "The house is rejecting you, Miriam," I said as I walked past. "Don't be absurd, Cyrus. It's a mechanical failure, one you should have prevented." "I'm working on it," I replied. I went to the basement and accessed the main water shutoff. I didn't turn it off. I simply adjusted the pressure regulator to its maximum setting. In an old house with copper pipes, a sudden surge in pressure creates a phenomenon known as water hammer, a loud, violent banging that sounds like someone is hitting the walls with a sledgehammer every time a tap is turned off. At 4 o'clock, Lydia's Mercedes pulled into the driveway. She climbed out, followed by the Hendersons, a wealthy, older couple who valued quiet dignity above all else. Lydia was in full performance mode, her gestures wide and inviting as she led them toward our front door. "And this is our home," I heard her say through the open window. "A labor of love, My husband is a master craftsman, as you can see from the detail work. I met them at the door, wearing my best disturbed expression. Not a caricature, but a subtle, flickering look of exhaustion and hypervigilance. I held a mallet in my hand. "Welcome," I said, my voice a bit too loud. "Careful where you step. The floorboards are lively today." Lydia's smile twitched. "Cyrus, honey, why don't you go wash up? I've got tea ready for our guests." We sat in the living room. Miriam entered, carrying a silver tray with the poise of a duchess. She began to pour the tea. As soon as she finished and set the kettle down, I stood up and walked to the kitchen, turning on the cold water for a second, then flicking it off hard. Bang! Clang! Thump! The pipes behind the living room wall let out a series of rhythmic, violent shudders. The Hendersons jumped, nearly spilling their tea. "Goodness!" Mrs. Henderson gasped. "What was that?" "Rats," I said, staring intently at the wall. "Big ones. They've been getting into the framing. I've been trying to hunt them down, but they're clever. They hide in the voids where you can't see them." Lydia's face turned a mottled shade of red. "It's just the pipe settling, Mrs. Henderson. Cyrus is being thorough with the maintenance." "I'm checking the gaps," I whispered, loud enough for them to hear. I began to tap on the wall with the mallet, moving closer to where they were sitting. "I think I heard one behind the crown molding. They eat the wires, you know. They can turn a house into a pile of ash in an afternoon if you don't stay ahead of them." The Hendersons exchanged a look, the exact look Nolan had described. The look of people realizing they were in the presence of someone who was no longer quite right. Lydia tried to salvage the conversation, launching into the merits of the Oak Street market, but her voice was shrill. "Anyway," she pivoted, her hands shaking as she opened the contract folder. "About the Ridge property. I think we've addressed all the concerns." "Except for the hillside," I interrupted. I sat back down, leaning in close to Mr. Henderson. "I was talking to the crew up there today. Beautiful view, but you know what they say about building on sand. Or in this case, unstable shale. The landscapers are worried about the retaining walls. I'd hate to see a beautiful couple like you lose everything in a mudslide because the realtor was too focused on the commission to notice the cracks." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Lydia looked like she wanted to vanish into the floorboards. Mr. Henderson slowly closed the contract folder. "I think," he said, his voice cold and formal, "that we would like to seek a second opinion on the structural integrity of the Ridge House. And perhaps we should finish this discussion another time, Lydia." They left within 5 minutes. The moment the front door closed, the house fell into a terrifying quiet. Lydia turned to me, her eyes brimming with a cold, predatory light. "You just cost us $200,000, she hissed. "What is wrong with you? You're acting like a lunatic." "I'm just being observant, Lydia, like you taught me. You have to look for the flaws, right? The hidden gaps, the rats in the wall." Miriam stood in the shadows of the hallway, her arms crossed. "This is exactly what we discussed, Lydia. He's a liability. He's destroying everything you've worked for." "I'm not destroying anything," I said, walking toward the stairs. "I'm just showing you what happens when a structure isn't as solid as it looks on the outside. You should check your email, Lydia. I think you'll find that the Hendersons aren't the only ones who are starting to ask questions about your professional ethics." I went upstairs and found Gage in his room. He was sitting on his bed, holding the digital level I'd given him. "Daddy?" he asked. "Is the house okay?" I sat down next to him and ruffled his hair. "The house is fine, Gage. We're just clearing out some of the rot so we can see what's left. It gets a little noisy during the demolition phase, but it'll be quiet again soon. I promise." I looked out the window and saw a car parked down the street. It was the same car from the night before. Evan Cross was watching the house. He thought he was waiting for the right moment to step in and claim the spoils. He didn't realize that I'd already begun to dismantle the very ground he was standing on. I pulled out my phone and sent a single text to Nolan. Phase 1 complete. Start the inquiry into the shell company. I felt a surge of energy, a calm, focused intensity. I wasn't the victim of their plan. I was the architect of their downfall. And I was going to make sure that when the walls finally came down, they were the ones trapped inside the rubble. The rain began as a rhythmic drumming against the roof, a persistent sound that masked the internal groans of the house. I spent the morning in the basement, not as a laborer, but as a conductor. I had bypassed the smart home hub, rerouting the security feed to a private server I'd set up on an old laptop. Now, I could see the driveway, the porch, and the guest wing entrance from a small screen tucked behind a stack of plywood. I watched as Lydia left the house, her movements jerky and frantic. She was no longer the poised realtor. She was a woman trying to hold together a collapsing frame with scotch tape. Once the Mercedes cleared the end of the street, I turned my attention to the silver sedan parked 2 houses down. Evan Cross was there, just as I expected. He was a creature of habit and opportunity, waiting for the precisely calculated moment to step in as the savior. I didn't want him waiting anymore. I wanted him inside the perimeter where I could measure him. I walked out to the driveway and began loading my truck with heavy toolboxes, making sure my movements were visible. I made a show of checking my watch and looking frustrated, then I climbed into the cab and drove away. I circled the block, parked 3 streets over in a neighbor's hidden alleyway, and doubled back through the wooded lot that bordered our property. I knew the terrain. I'd graded it myself when we first broke ground. I entered the house through the basement bulkhead, moving with the silence of a shadow in a familiar room. Inside, the house felt different. Without Lydia's performative energy, it was just a shell. I could hear Miriam upstairs, her voice a sharp, low murmur on the phone. She was likely calling her bridge club or the historical society, maintaining the social fortifications that protected her reputation. I sat in the darkness of the den, watching the security feed on my phone. 5 minutes later, Evan Cross approached the front door. He didn't knock. He had a key. That was a detail I hadn't confirmed until now, and it settled in my mind with a heavy, satisfying click. He entered the foyer, looking around with the predatory confidence of a man who already owned the air he breathed. Miriam met him at the base of the stairs. They didn't embrace. They stood a precise distance apart, like 2 business partners discussing a merger. "The Henderson deal is a disaster," I heard Miriam say through the high-gain microphone I'd tucked into the vent. "Cyrus is becoming a significant obstacle. He's no longer just a passive variable." "He's a carpenter, Miriam," Cross replied, his voice a smooth, oily baritone. "He's a man who thinks in straight lines. We just need to bend the environment until he snaps. The paperwork for the involuntary evaluation is already drafted. Once the local police get the report about his behavior with the Hendersons, the rest is just procedure." "Make it happen quickly," Miriam said. "I want to be out of this house by the weekend. The humidity in this wing is unbearable, and the plumbing is a disgrace." I waited for Cross to leave. I watched him walk back to his car, his gait relaxed. I didn't follow him. I had a different destination. I went to the guest wing while Miriam was in the kitchen. I didn't go into her room. I went to the mechanical closet behind it. I took a small specialized tool, a signal jammer I'd modified from an old Wi-Fi booster, and tucked it behind the drywall. By the time Miriam returned to her room, she would find her digital world erased. No phone signal, no internet, no connection to the bank accounts or the social circles she used as weapons. She would be isolated in a humid, dark room with a faucet that only whispered. I then drove to the office park where Evan Cross kept his consultancy. It was a glass and steel building that looked as hollow as his soul. I didn't go to his office. I waited in the parking garage. When he arrived, I stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, still wearing my work vest, my hammer hanging prominently from my belt. Cross stopped, his hand freezing on the handle of his car door. He didn't look scared. He looked annoyed, as if I were a smudge on his sleeve. "Cyrus, this is a surprise. I heard you weren't feeling yourself lately. I've never felt more like myself, Evan, I said, walking toward him. I didn't rush. I didn't raise my voice. I simply occupied the space. I stopped 2 feet from him, close enough to see the way his eyes darted toward the exit. I've been doing some structural analysis. It's a hobby of mine. I found some interesting things on Oak Street. Cross's posture shifted. The arrogance didn't vanish, but it hardened into something defensive. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. I think you know exactly how many distressed properties you've laundered through Lydia's listings. I also think you know that the shell company you're using, the one registered in a coastal jurisdiction, has a very thin paper trail. It only takes one person with the right blueprints to show where the hidden rooms are. You have nothing, Cross spat. You're a man who hits nails for a living. You're about to be removed from your own home for being a hazard to your family. Is that what Miriam told you? I smiled, and for the first time, it felt genuine. It was the smile of a man who knows the roof is about to collapse and is standing safely in the doorway. Miriam is a planner, Evan, but she's old school. She thinks control is about who has the loudest voice. You and I know it's about who controls the infrastructure. I stepped even closer, into his personal bubble. I could smell his expensive aftershave. I didn't come here to threaten you. I came here to give you an out. You're a practical man. You were never going to run away with Lydia. She was just the key to the vault. But the vault is empty, Evan. I've already moved the assets. I've alerted the board of realtors to an anonymous audit of her recent sales. And I've given a very detailed map of your shell company's activities to a friend of mine who works for the State Revenue Office. Cross's face went pale, not the paleness of fear, but of a sudden cold calculation. He was realizing the math had changed. Miriam is the one you want, I continued, my voice a whisper now. She's the architect. Lydia is just the foreman. You're the subcontractor. And in my world, when a job goes south, the subcontractor is the first one to get cut. If you walk away now, leave the keys, leave the state, and never answer a call from either of them again, I might forget to send the final set of documents to the revenue office. I'm a carpenter. I like things to be clean. I don't like unnecessary debris. Cross looked at me for a long time. I could see him weighing the risk. He looked at my hands, calloused, scarred, and steady. He looked at the hammer on my belt. He wasn't afraid of violence. He was afraid of the relentless, methodical pressure I represented. She told me you were a simpleton, Cross said quietly. I am, I said. I believe in level lines and solid foundations. You should have checked the specs before you started the build. He didn't say another word. He got into his car and drove away, tires chirping against the concrete. I knew I wouldn't see him again. He was a scavenger, and scavengers don't stay when the environment becomes hostile. I returned home to find a state of quiet panic. Miriam was standing in the foyer, her face flushed. She was clicking her cell phone repeatedly, her thumb moving with a frantic, desperate energy. Cyrus! The phones are out, the internet is gone, and I can't get the guest wing door to unlock from the inside, she snapped. The house is settling, Miriam, I said, walking toward the kitchen to fix a sandwich. Wood expands and contracts. Metal fatigues. Sometimes things just lock up when they've been under too much tension for too long. Lydia arrived a few minutes later, her eyes red-rimmed. She didn't even look at me. She went straight to the liquor cabinet and poured a glass of wine, her hands shaking so much the glass clinked against the bottle. The Hendersons officially backed out, she whispered, and I got a call from the office. There's an inquiry. Someone flagged the Oak Street files. That's a shame, I said, taking a bite of my sandwich. It sounds like the structure is failing, Lydia. You should have been more careful with the load-bearing elements. Miriam looked from Lydia to me, her eyes narrowing as she finally began to see the shape of the trap. She wasn't the administrator anymore. She was a guest in a house that was slowly turning into a cage. What did you do, Cyrus? she asked, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. I didn't do anything you didn't teach me, Miriam, I said. I looked down. I saw the bags under the floorboards. I saw the lies in the walls. And I decided that if this house was going to be hollowing itself out, I might as well be the one to choose where the debris falls. I walked to the thermostat and turned the heat up to 85 degrees. The HVAC hummed to life, but only in the guest wing. I could hear the vents beginning to rattle, a sound I'd engineered by placing loose metal shavings inside the ducts. I'm going to go read Gage a story, I said. He's been having trouble sleeping. He says he hears things in the walls. I told him not to worry. It's just the sound of the old world being dismantled to make room for the new one. I left them standing in the kitchen. Two women who had spent months planning my erasure, now standing in a house that was actively erasing them. The silence that followed me up the stairs wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a structure that has finally reached its breaking point. The heat in the guest wing reached a sweltering peak by midnight, turning the air into a thick, syrupy weight. I sat in the darkened living room, the only light coming from the faint green glow of the security monitors. Through the lens of the hallway camera, I watched Miriam emerge from her room, her face slick with perspiration. She looked diminished, the sharp edges of her authority softened by the oppressive humidity. She paced the corridor, checking the thermostat repeatedly, but the dials were unresponsive. I had bypassed the local controls. The house was now answering only to the commands I sent from my phone. She tried the phone in the hallway, a landline she insisted on keeping for her important calls. She lifted the receiver, but there was no dial tone, only a flat, hollow hum. I had rerouted the copper wiring in the basement, tying the phone line into a small amplifier that played a looped recording of ambient house noises, the sound of a distant door closing, the faint creak of a floorboard, the rhythmic ticking of a clock. She held the phone to her ear for a long time, her expression shifting from irritation to a strange, creeping realization. The house was talking back to her, and it wasn't saying anything she wanted to hear. Lydia remained in the master bedroom, the door locked. I could hear her pacing, the sharp click of her heels on the hardwood muffled by the thick rugs. She was likely trying to reach Evan Cross, unaware that he was already miles away, shedding his association with her like a layer of old skin. Every few minutes, I would use the smart home interface to flicker the lights in her room, just for a microsecond, a blink in the electrical current. It was a subtle, persistent reminder that the very infrastructure of her life was no longer stable. Cyrus? I didn't turn around. I knew the sound of Miriam's footsteps. She walked into the living room, her shadow stretching long and thin across the floor. She sat in the armchair opposite me, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the fabric of her skirt. "You've made your point," she said, her voice sounding dry and brittle. "The mechanical issues, the isolation, it's a very clever display of petulance. But you're only delaying the inevitable. The documents are already in motion. Your reputation in this town is already a memory." I looked at her, my eyes adjusted to the dark. "A reputation is just a facade, Miriam. Like the paint on a house. You can strip it off, you can change the color, but the frame remains. I've spent my life making sure the frames I build are solid. You've spent yours rearranging the furniture in houses you don't own. I am the reason this family has any standing at all," she hissed. "I gave Lydia the tools to succeed. I gave her the vision to see beyond this mediocrity. You were always just a temporary fixture, Cyrus. A necessary support while the real structure was being built." I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees. "The problem with your vision, Miriam, is that you didn't account for the material. You thought you could treat people like lumber, cut them, shape them, and nail them into place. But people aren't static. We change. We observe." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. It was Miriam's. I'd found it tucked behind a loose brick in the garden shed weeks ago. In it, She had meticulously documented every perceived slight, every financial transaction, and her long-term plan for Gage's education. An education that involved removing him from my influence entirely. It was a blueprint for a life that didn't include me. "This is a very detailed plan," I said, tapping the cover. "It's a shame it's based on a false set of measurements. You see, you thought Evan Cross was your ally. You thought he was the one who would facilitate the move. But Evan is a man of business, and business requires a solid return on investment. Once I showed him the cracks in your financial foundation, he realized your project was a loss." Miriam's face went pale. The composure she had worn like armor for 30 years began to crack. "What are you talking about?" "I've spent the last 48 hours talking to the bank, Miriam. The joint account you encouraged Lydia to set up, the one where you've been safeguarding the commissions from the Oak Street deals. I've flagged it for suspicious activity. Since my name is on the primary mortgage and the business license, the bank was very cooperative. They've frozen the assets pending a full audit." The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the rattling of the vents in the guest wing. Miriam looked as if she had been struck. Her social standing, her lifestyle, her very sense of self was tied to that capital. Without it, she wasn't a school administrator or a pillar of the community. She was just an elderly woman in a hot room. "You wouldn't," she whispered. "That would ruin Lydia, too." "Lydia ruined herself when she signed those lease agreements," I said. "I'm just the one documenting the damage. I've already spoken to a lawyer, a real one, not one of the consultants you use. We're going to discuss the legalities of domestic deception and the systematic alienation of a parent. It's a very sturdy case, Miriam, built to code." I stood up and walked to the wall near the pantry. I picked up a crowbar I'd left leaning against the counter. Miriam flinched, her eyes wide. I didn't move toward her. I moved toward the framed portrait of Miriam's late husband that hung in the center of the hallway, a man she spoke of as a saint, a man whose legacy she used to justify her every move. I carefully pried the frame from the wall. I didn't break the glass. I just held it in my hands. "You talk a lot about legacy, Miriam, about what we leave behind. But look at this wall." I pointed to the spot where the portrait had hung. Behind the frame, the wallpaper was a different shade, a bright, unfaded rectangle that revealed exactly how much the rest of the house had aged and changed. "You've been hiding behind this for years," I said, "using a memory to control the present. But beneath the surface, there's nothing but drywall and dust. I'm taking the house back, Miriam. Every room, every hallway, every hidden space. You are no longer an authority here. You are a guest who has overstayed her welcome." I walked to the front door and opened it. The cool, rain-scented air rushed in, clashing with the stagnant heat of the house. "Tomorrow morning, a moving crew will arrive. They aren't here for my things. They're here for yours. I've arranged for a storage unit on the other side of the county, paid for 1 month. After that, you're on your own." "Cyrus, you can't do this!" Lydia's voice came from the top of the stairs. She was leaning over the banister, her face distraught. "This is my house, too." "It was a house," I said, looking up at her. "But you turned it into a staging ground. You turned our son's bedroom into a place where he had to learn how to hide in the walls. You broke the most basic rule of construction, Lydia. You never compromised the safety of the occupants." I turned back to Miriam. She was sitting in the chair, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. The fire in her eyes had been replaced by a hollow, flickering uncertainty. "I'm going to go sleep in Gage's room tonight," I said, "to make sure he feels safe, because that's what a father does. He protects the interior. Tomorrow, we start the final phase. We're going to see what's left when all the lies are hauled away in a dumpster." I walked away, leaving the front door standing wide open. I didn't care about the security risk. There was nothing left in this house worth stealing that hadn't already been taken. As I climbed the stairs, I heard the sound of Miriam finally breaking. Not a scream, but a low, jagged sob that echoed through the hollow spaces I'd created. I entered Gage's room and sat on the edge of his bed. He was awake, his eyes bright in the darkness. "Is it over, Daddy?" "Almost, buddy," I said, pulling the blanket up to his chin. "We just have to finish the final walkthrough, then we can go somewhere where the walls don't have secrets." I stayed there until he fell asleep, listening to the house. The banging in the pipes had stopped. The flickering lights had stabilized. The structure was settling into a new reality. I felt a cold, hard sense of accomplishment. I hadn't used chaos to win. I hadn't used violence. I had used the very tools they tried to use against me: observation, calculation, and a deep understanding of how things are put together. I closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep. I was busy measuring the final moments. I was visualizing the exact moment when the last of their influence would be cleared out, leaving a clean, level surface where I could finally begin to build something real. The house remembered everything, but tonight, it was finally learning how to forget. The morning sun arrived with a clinical, unforgiving brightness that exposed every grain of dust in the foyer. I stood in the center of the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee competing with the lingering, humid scent of the guest wing's failed ventilation. I was already dressed in my work gear: canvas trousers, heavy boots, and a gray shirt. My movements were slow and intentional. I wasn't a man in a hurry anymore. When you reach the final stage of a build, the finishing work requires the most patience. Lydia and Miriam were already there, seated at the breakfast nook like two figures in a museum exhibit. They hadn't slept. Lydia's eyes were rimmed with dark shadows, her expensive silk blouse wrinkled and stained with spilled wine. Miriam looked aged, her posture no longer a rigid line of authority, but a sagging curve of exhaustion. They watched me as I pulled a thick stack of manila folders from my briefcase and laid them out on the granite island, one by one. "This is the final audit," I said, my voice calm and resonant in the quiet house. "I spent the night finishing the documentation. It's all here: the redirected commissions, the shell company communications, and the logs of the instructional sessions Miriam held with Gage regarding his disappearance drills." Lydia reached for a folder, but her hand stopped inches away, trembling. "Cyrus, please. We can talk about this. We can go to counseling. I was scared about our future. My mother convinced me that you were failing, that the business was going under." "Don't blame me for your lack of spine, Lydia," Miriam snapped, though the fire was gone from her voice. She looked at me, her gaze cold and hollow. "You think you've won because you've locked the doors and frozen some accounts? You're a small man, Cyrus. You'll always be a small man in a small house." "This house isn't small anymore, Miriam," I said. "It's exactly the size it needs to be to hold the truth. And the truth is that you are both legally and socially insolvent." I slid a final paper across the counter toward them. It was a formal notice of eviction, served by me as the sole owner of the property title, a title I had quietly moved into a protected trust weeks before they even began their exit strategy. I had seen the signs of their betrayal long before the fever hit. A carpenter always notices when the house begins to lean, even if the movement is only a fraction of an inch at a time. "Evan Cross is gone," I said, watching Lydia's face. "He's signed a statement detailing his involvement in the Oak Street transactions. In exchange for my silence regarding his broader tax liabilities, he's provided a full accounting of your consultation fees. You aren't just losing your job, Lydia. You're losing your license. The board is meeting this afternoon. I've already sent them the digital copies." Lydia let out a small, broken sound, her head dropping into her hands. The image she had spent a decade building, the successful, high-powered realtor with the perfect family, was evaporating. She was realizing that she hadn't been the one in control. She had been a component in a machine she didn't understand, and I had just pulled the plug. "As for you, Miriam," I said, turning to the older woman, "your social standing in this town is built on a foundation of perceived virtue. I've taken the liberty, of sending a small donation to the Historical Society in your name. Along with it, I included a summary of your pedagogical methods, specifically the part where you taught a 7-year-old how to hide in a maintenance cavity so his father wouldn't find him. They were quite interested in the ethics of that. Miriam's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The social fortress she had spent her life maintaining was being dismantled brick by brick, and she was powerless to stop it. She wasn't being attacked, she was being exposed. I heard footsteps on the stairs. Gage walked into the kitchen, dressed in his favorite t-shirt and carrying his backpack. He looked at the scene, the folders, the broken women at the table, and me. He didn't look afraid. He looked like a boy who finally understood the floor was solid beneath him. "Is the truck ready, Daddy?" he asked. "Almost, buddy. Go wait on the porch. I'll be out in a minute." Gage walked past his mother and grandmother without a word. He didn't look back. The training they had given him, the drills, the secrets, the lessons in deception, had failed. They had tried to turn him into a ghost, but he was my son. He valued the truth because I had taught him how to build it. I turned back to the table. I picked up the hammer I had left on the counter the day before. I didn't swing it. I just held it, feeling the weight of the steel and the smooth grain of the hickory handle. "I built this kitchen," I said, looking at the custom cabinetry. "I chose this stone. I laid every tile on that backsplash. I did it because I wanted a place where my family would be safe. You turned it into a trap. You used the very walls I raised to try and bury me." I walked to the front door, the heavy oak swinging open with a familiar, solid creak. Outside, the world was bright and indifferent to the wreckage inside. I looked back one last time. Lydia was still crying, a soft, pathetic sound that no longer moved me. Miriam was staring at the wall where her husband's portrait had once hung, her face a mask of bitter, silent realization. "The movers will be here in an hour," I said. "Anything left in the house after that goes to the landfill. I suggest you start with the bags you hid under the floorboards. At least they're already packed." I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut. The sound was final. The heavy click of the lock bolt engaging, the latch settling into the strike plate with a definitive mechanical snap. It was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I walked to the truck where Gage was already buckled into the passenger seat. I climbed into the driver's side and started the engine. The vibration of the motor was a steady, reassuring pulse. I checked the mirrors, put the truck in reverse, and backed out of the driveway I had paved myself. As we reached the end of the street, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't need to see the house. I knew the specs. I knew the dimensions. I knew that, for the first time in a long time, the structure was empty of rot. I reached over and turned on the radio, a low, upbeat tune filling the cab. Gage looked at me and smiled, a real, unburdened smile that reached his eyes. We were moving away from the beige siding, the manicured lawn, and the hollow walls. We were leaving the architecture of betrayal behind, heading toward a horizon that I would measure and build on my own terms. I took a deep breath, the air clear and free of the dust of demolition. The job was finished. The site was cleared. The revenge wasn't a fire. It was a perfectly level foundation. And from here, I could build anything. I drove toward the highway, the house shrinking in the distance until it was nothing more than a speck of beige against the green hills. I reached into the glove box, pulled out a fresh notepad and a carpenter's pencil, and handed them to Gage. "Start drawing, buddy," I said. "Tell me what the next one should look like." He began to draw, the pencil scratching against the paper with a rhythmic, hopeful sound. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands steady on the wheel. The past was a set of blueprints for a building that no longer existed. The future was a blank plot of land, and I was the one with the tools. I didn't need an epilogue. I didn't need to know where Lydia and Miriam ended up, or how Evan Cross would explain his sudden relocation. The story ended the moment the lock turned. It ended the moment the house ceased to be a home and became just a collection of materials. I was no longer defined by the spaces they had tried to trap me in. I was the master of the measurement, the architect of my own escape. The truck hummed as we hit 60 miles per hour, the wind whistling through the slightly cracked window. I felt light. I felt solid. I felt like a man who had finally finished a long, difficult day of work